Hello everyone, my name is Cameron Cowan. This is the Cameron Joel Newshour. Thank you all so much for stopping by. I appreciate it. We're getting the start right at the top of the hour tonight because we have a lot of news stories. I want to remind everyone to head over to CameronJoel.com/subscribe and become a Cameron Joel Plus member. You can also, at the same time, sign up for the Saturday newsletter, where I discuss all sorts of interesting news stories and give you the latest updates from me and all this sort of thing. I am looking into shifting around how we do some content and things around here, which I think will be really cool. I also want to remind everyone that if you are comfortable on Substack, I do repost the newsletter and interviews to Substack. So make sure to head over to CameronJournal.substack.com and you can follow me there. It's the same content as on the Cameron Journal, but if you're already on Substack, don't want to start another account, I get you. I'm on Substack as well. So feel free to check that out. I also wanted to remind everyone, my next book, America's Lost Generation, about millennials and our story, is coming out on September 12th. We've actually picked a date, September 12th, so a little under a month now. And I want to remind everyone you can head over to CameronJournal.com/Camerons-books, or just go to CameronJournal.com, click on Shop Cameron's Books, and you can pre-order that, and it will be out on September 12th on Amazon and Target and Barnes & Noble and all those fun places. I just recently finished, I think the last one went out Sunday, my new 10-part series on kind of the best of from the book. And so if you also want to stop by and read some of that, you can click on Millennials, and in the navigation bar, it's under Culture, and you can read that whole collection. If you signed up for the newsletter, it would have been delivered right to you. So I want to remind everyone about that. I am working on currently some specific content about America's Lost Generation and millennials and what has happened in the intervening 15 years since the Great Financial Crisis. So I'll admit I'm struggling a bit this evening because there are some days when doing this, going on this journey, is fun and exciting and exhilarating, and I'm so glad that I'm doing it. And there are other days when it is extremely hard. I very rarely cancel the news hour outside of select instances. I'm not feeling well, all this type of thing. I almost cancel today just because sometimes this all feels really pointless. I did a video in 2024. It's on the channel. It's called My Creator Journey. And it's 2 hours. And I kind of tell the whole story of how I got into this industry, how I, started the Cameron Journal, my first iteration of the show, how I learned WordPress, and how to do video and do audio, and all of these cool, at the time, years ago, these were new tools and a new democratization of making media that had, not existed before. And I today, and most recently, it's all feeling quite heavy because I know what I do is incredibly valuable to people, and I am so grateful that people come and read my stuff. But the unfortunate reality about this business, and this is true of most content creators unless you're at the very top end, is there's not necessarily a lot of great money into it. And when I was young and in my 20s, I didn't necessarily care about that as much. But now that I am nearer to 40 than not, it really starts to show, where friends are kind of outrunning you and outpacing you and all this sort of thing. And I had done a graduate program kind of through the pandemic, and I was hoping that was going to open up a lot of doors for me, and it never really did. And so I've said all that to say my heart is a little heavy this evening because I'm looking at my life and I'm looking at this situation, and yeah, it's not necessarily a great day to be me. My heart is full, and that doesn't necessarily make me the most happy, chipper, upbeat sort of person. It makes me someone who almost canceled the broadcast this evening, just so I could, very honestly, go back to bed and go back to sleep, because I'm also very tired today. And I am, I'm just so mindful and so grateful for everyone that, everyone that comes along and participates. I've always wondered maybe why more people don't interact, or more people don't comment, or more people don't write in, and then, sometimes they do, which is really great. And a lot of times, though, they don't necessarily. But I've always wondered that, and I just wish. What do I wish? I wish there were more. Just more people involved, and more people, invested in, this whole thing. And I very much, I very much miss, I think, some of the interactions that I've had with people, that I'm used to having with people, and sometimes I wonder what the point of it is. What's the point of all of this? And I sincerely hope and sincerely wish that people are enjoying this, and that someone somewhere is getting something out of it. But I sometimes look at other creators with a little bit of jealousy, because it seems like their comment sections are full and people are just obsessed with them as people. And sometimes I kind of wonder, oh, maybe I'm just not that interesting, or, the news is kind of pointless, and all this sort of thing. And maybe the time for old-fashioned news broadcasts like what I do, which kind of lets you decide, what you think about all this stuff, and empowers you with information and news stories and news narratives. Maybe there's just no demand for that. People are unplugged, people are tired, sort of thing. I don't know. It's an interesting sort of thing, and it's really hard to spend a lot of years of your life quietly working away on your own thing, and meeting people and getting new subscribers and being happy every time someone comes along, and all this type of thing. And then at some point, you look around and you're kind of like, I'm just not making it. I'm not really living. I'm not able to have fun. I'm not able to take a vacation. I'm not able to do so many things because I'm doing this thing, and it's really hard because it's like, this is what you should be doing. And you get these comments from people that are just so, fulfilling and uplifting, or I'll be in an interview and someone's like, yeah, I went and watched, I really enjoy what you do, and it's just kind of like, oh, that's so good. But then bills come due, life happens, and you're kind of like, wow, I wish doing the thing that I am meant to do paid a little bit better. And anyway, I'm not here to whine and complain, but my heart is heavy tonight. And so that I would just wanted to kind of share what was on my heart, what was on my brain, what was on my mind, because this is the type of day when showing up is hard. The old adage, 90% of life is showing up. The part that they kind of tell you is sometimes that's easy and sometimes that's not. And today is one of the days that is where it's not. And it adds an extra level of difficulty when it's just like, yeah, I really wish that I could just move on with my life. And I kind of laugh because and many people kind of know this, but I was not intending to go back into this business full time after grad school. We got through the pandemic. I graduated in February of 23, and I was kind of like, good, excellent. I've applied a bunch of fellowships. The Cameron Journal will be a place for me to do my writing, but it'll back burner, and we'll, maybe probably bring the podcast to a close, or do it on a very limited basis sort of thing. And, but my main energy will be elsewhere. And then when none of that worked out, and I had to figure out some way to make this work, that added an extra level of difficulty that I definitely was not prepared for. And it has been a struggle since then to figure all of this out. And I wouldn't say things are in the same place they were a couple years ago. They're definitely not. There's some potentially exciting things happening along the way, but it's hard today. We'll just say that. It's hard today, and sometimes honesty is the best policy, because I like to feel like I'm building a relationship with people who watch these shows, with the people that come by to hang out during a live broadcast and watch it later. I do feel like a certain measure of honesty is certainly helpful, productive even. And so I just kind of wanted to share where I was this evening and why tonight's broadcast will probably be a little bit different. I may not cover all the news stories I have. Last Monday we were a little short because I didn't have that much I wanted to talk about. But let's just dive into the headlines. Let me click this button, and we'll dive into the headlines. So, this one, this was an interesting sort of tweet from a narrative perspective. I'm always very interested in narrative and kind of what people are saying. I enjoy Twitter for that purpose because it kind of lets me know where people's heads are at. And it says here, I'm not a policy guy, but it seems to me that in the past 5 years or so, a kind of enchantment has been lifted from the public mind. The experts used to bedazzle all and sundry with tales of complicated 2D and 3D order effects, such that any straightforward initiative of the state would certainly fail, backfire, or jeopardize other goods. See Hirschman's famous book. Now, however, people are remembering that the main effect of policy matters, that policies often do just work straightforwardly in the public interest, and that vigorous public action is good, actually. Here's the question he's forgetting. Good for who? A lot of those second and third order effects had to do with other communities that were affected by a policy change, or businesses that were affected by a policy change, or the way in which people change living. And now a lot of people are not necessarily affected by these policies, but for the ones that are, they're the ones that are affected. And that sometimes can cause people... And there's a French philosopher named Gaston Bachelard that talks about this. Anytime there's a system, people are going to look for the shortest way to get to their goal. And if it's working through the system because the system's efficient, they'll do it. The minute the system becomes too big and gangly, they'll find ways around it. That's the second and third order effects that a lot of these people are talking about, is the way people changed things, did different things, whatever have you, in order to get around a policy or a new aspect of the system that just didn't work for them, or they didn't care about, or a need they still needed to fulfill that the system wasn't letting them fulfill. That's where a lot of this kind of stuff comes from. And I know about what he's talking about, because Freakonomics was very popular for a while, and this is, this is all, kind of part of that, understanding, real effects. Like, for example, the big Freakonomics breakthrough was that the reason crime went down after 1990 is because of abortion. A lot of the would-be criminals of the 90s and 2000s were just simply never born. And this top comment kind of echoes that, where it says, I remember hearing not long ago from some fancy PhDs that banning abortion actually increases abortion rates because it sends women who would otherwise have openly discussed abortion with a counselor and perhaps been dissuaded, instead to go and get an abortion by yourself without any chance to be dissuaded. There's no empirical evidence for this, of course, and amount of evidence against it, but the Bright said it, so we had to take it very seriously indeed. So, there are lots of things, and I think... it's a commenting on a Christopher Rufo post, which is like, I know it sounds crazy, but arresting criminals reduces crime. Only if you arrest the right people. In any given city, most crime is produced by about 300 people. If you arrested all of them, crime would go down by about 60%. And I think there's definitely... I will say this, and we'll move on. There is definitely a hunger in society. People know things are not working. People know the world has problems. They may not know the specifics, but they've got the mood. It's very important for people to feel like someone is doing something. And I think the odd public policy place we're in right now is that people are willing to get on board with anything as long as someone's doing something. Incidentally, this is how you get to fascism very quickly. And one wonders how we got there. And it's this type of attitude of, well, he's at least doing something, or at least they're arresting the criminals, or at least someone's fight, rather than, kind of the old regime, which was just standing around being like, yeah, things are bad, but we can't really do anything about that, universal health care, sort of thing. And people are kind of like, not interested in universal health care because I have great health insurance with my employer, as do most Americans, but how about the crime, sort of thing. And that, the whole, soft on crime rhetoric sort of thing has been a cudgel used against Democrats for decades. And to be honest, for most people that live in cities and everything, they would say, yeah, and the failure of American cities kind of shows that it wasn't just a cudgel used against Democrats unfairly. It was a real thing that needed address. And I think that, now we're to the point where people are just willing to let anyone implement anything as long as they're implementing something, because at least it's something. Now, I tend to think, especially as someone who's a triple minority, just implementing policy doesn't usually end well for certain segments of the population. But I certainly understand people's mood of just being like, yeah, go for it, sure, go crazy, and being willing to do whatever, try whatever, in the hopes of some improvement, and not necessarily caring about who else is affected by it. And I think this, the replies definitely are reflective of that. So, this is good. So I've talked a lot about Christian nationalism. Last week we watched a video from the Military Religious Freedom Foundation. And I have mentioned in the last couple shows Doug Wilson, who is very connected to Pete Hegseth and the Trump administration writ large. And he says here, he reposted it himself and said, "All of Christ for all of life," which is a tagline that we use. "This is the first time we've had connections with as many people in the national government as we do now. We're trying to give these people an opportunity to meet with God. I think the 19th Amendment was a bad idea." And there's a video.
He didn't just repost it like, oh, here's an interesting thing that these weird people are doing. He reposted it, and he himself said, "All of Christ for all of life," which is the tagline that we use. So he was, in effect, reposting it and saying amen at some level.
Pastor Doug Wilson, the network's co-founder, is no stranger to controversy, with his church's embrace of patriarchy and Christian nationalism. They are a network of over 130 churches and have recently opened a new church in Washington, D.C., with Hegseth attending its first Sunday service.
This is the first time we've had connections with as many people in national government as we do now, but this is not an ecclesiastical lobbying effort where we're trying to meet important people. We're trying to give some of these people an opportunity to meet with God.
Wilson's church and the wider network believe and practice the idea that men and women have different roles, and women should not hold church leadership positions.
My wife votes, my daughters vote. If people rush to conclusions from what they heard on the CNN piece, that's a sad thing. At the same time, I think that the 19th Amendment was a bad idea, and I had no problem with how Pastor Jared answered the question. I would support that. Our issue is not a problem with the enfranchisement of women. Our problem is with the disenfranchisement of the household.
And there you have it. This reminds me of, I just came up with it. There was this documentary called The Family. The organization that started the National Prayer Breakfast, it was started by a man named Doug Coe. I was sitting here racking my brain trying to think of it. And he had made quite a name for himself in Washington, D.C. years ago, and how he got the National Prayer Breakfast started. By basically evangelizing to politicians, his attitude being, between the wolf and the sheep, who's going to care for the wolf? And he viewed himself as a pastor to people who have hard jobs and hard positions, have to make hard decisions. The reality is this gave him a huge in to government beginning in the Reagan administration and extending to the beginning, almost middle of the Obama years. He finally passed, I think, in the mid-2010s. His son tried to take over. I don't think that was very successful, but they had training programs for young men starting in the 80s and 90s to go to school, get into government, get into power, all to advance this sort of Christian nationalist notion. Everyone's finally talking about Christian nationalism, but as we know from the Military Religious Freedom Foundation, this is not new. This has been part and parcel of the Republican Party and of people within the Republican Party since at least the early 70s, starting with Pat Robinson and the whole 700 Club crew and, what's that dude in Oklahoma? Oral Roberts. This is all of this stuff that's happening with the Trump administration, be it the Christian nationalism, the white nationalism, the authoritarianism, none of this stuff is happening at this very moment in a vacuum. The reality is all of this stuff builds on layers. For example, I kind of laugh because when we talked about, the Patriot Act after 9/11 and the extraordinary powers it gave the federal government, people at the time said, this will come back to bite us one day. And that day is here. There was even frustration on the part of Congress about the authorization for military force, or AUFMs, and Congress actually ended up pulling all of them and caused a bunch of operations overseas to be killed off because Congress finally, got rid of authorization and quit funding several overseas adventures. And all of this is built in layers. All of it comes along as this more like a pervasive wave. The problem is that makes it very hard to track, because in a news narrative environment, we have a story and there's a beginning, there's a middle, and then there's sort of an end, and we move on. And the reality is, a lot of this stuff, there's actually a thread to it all. There is something that comes through from it all. So when we talk about federal overreach, we can say, yeah, that started with the Patriot Act, that started, with pandemic regulations. And the same thing with this conversation we're having on Christian nationalism. It's the same vibe. All of this stuff adds up over time, and now people feel emboldened, because some people agree with them, to really come out and start saying this stuff out loud and in meaningful ways. And this is on the AP from YouTube. And this sort of story isn't necessarily going away. And the unfortunate, reality is we now have people in power who are willing to promote this Christian nationalist agenda. And as I've long said, I think I said it last week, Trump is a moderating force on the GOP. They would be farther right and more Christian nationalist without the Trump influence. And I think that's where the party is going to go as soon as Trump is either out of power or dies, whatever that looks like. The party, I think, is going to lurch to the left and lurch in a Christian nationalist direction. And unfortunately, I don't necessarily think people are going to be against that. I saw a survey this weekend that was sent to me by about 3 people, showing how that the Gen Z is becoming more Christian, more specifically Catholic. The Catholic Church has more adult converts than I think the 1950s, and so they are people are rediscovering religion. I kind of view that as slipping back into superstition and is taking a step backwards as a society. But there's certainly a sort of great awakening happening, which happens in this country. When Billy Graham started becoming very popular in the 70s and 80s, even, people like, Tammy Baker and her husband, all those kind of, that big evangelical push that a lot of us grew up in the 80s and 90s was kind of part of a spiritual enlightenment that was occurring. And now, after, people kind of leaving that behind, that version of it behind at least, and going through a period of, non-religion, all this sort of thing, we're now kind of going back to religion is back in again, and it's good to be religious, and people are going in that direction. These things have an ebb and flow, and they come and go. My worry is that with people embracing religion more, when Christian nationalism comes to call, and it will come to call in the next several years, a lot of people will not realize how it will change the lifestyle in society. And we're seeing this now, where they're trying to roll back gay marriage, even though it's codified in law. That's not going to work. There's even been talk of getting rid of interracial marriage. Loving v. Virginia, very basic things that people have come to take for granted, but certain people think is the reason why society is falling apart. And I think the most dangerous thing is that a lot of people hyped up on their new religious fervor will think that their Christian nationalism is going to include them. And I have bad news. If you're Catholic or anything not evangelical, specifically these churches, they're not going to include you. Just know that. The new Christian nationalism is not going to include your religion just because you believe in God. They want you to be their specific religion, going to their specific churches. And that's the problem MRFF is fighting in the military. Most of the calls for MRFF do not come from atheists. They come from people of other religions who are being intimidated to worship a specific way. And if you think that someone like Doug Wilson is going to be happy walking in lockstep with the Catholic Church. No. And that's one of the aspects of Christian nationalism a lot of people are not going to understand. But I also fear they're not going to resist it when it comes along because they don't understand how pernicious the movement is. So, I wanted to highlight the video because I had talked about Doug Wilson, and I think I couldn't find this video, and so I wanted to bring it back up so that people have a chance to see it. This story I am going to move through quickly just because as an academic person, it's quite sad. It says here for the academic year, well, here's what happened. Let's start from the beginning. Here's what I understand is the real catastrophe in all this. It is probably true that PhD cohorts are too large in the humanities. The doctorate predates capitalism. What was once an apprenticeship between prof and student has been gradually subsumed into capitalist labor relations. This is in reaction to this post where that shows that a university is going to reduce the amount of people studying PhDs in these fields, which includes art history, cinema, media studies, East English languages and civilizations, English language and literature, linguistics, music composition, and philosophy. It says, universities love to brag about this when they're fighting grad unionization campaigns. You're not a worker, you're a student. But over the 20th century, this model became a convenient way for unis to find cheap labor to teach larger enrollments in the post-war university. True. As many of you know, some programs admit more students than they expect to award degrees. They need labor to teach large intro courses, especially at public institutions, without giant endowments. I think this is bad. It is bad on why they're expanding tenure track lines, but it contributes. I think it also produces a dangerous feedback mechanism between students who feel, not incorrectly, like they were promised jobs but sent into the mines, so to speak. Again, TAing, i.e. being a teacher's assistant, is job training, but nobody wants to tell this to prospective students who idealize that earlier model. So in a lab or a sim university game, you could try reducing enrollments to get the university back up to speed and working for everyone, but we don't live in a computer model. These are jobs, critical infrastructure. This is how the university has decided to reproduce itself, and it's also where our society has stored knowledge reproduction. So to speak, when you cut enrollments like this, doesn't make individual institutions more efficient. It threatens to quite literally end that knowledge's ability to be reproduced. This is a world historic disaster, and there's no coming back from that. And I've written about this, and I'm not going to talk about it for a long time. As someone in the humanities, it is devastating to see what has happened in the intervening 15 years. And the way arts and humanities have been disincentivized at the K through 12 level, and now college, and now PhD programs. It means there'll be less people studying these things, which Molly would say, that's a good thing. Okay, fine. Less people studying these things, less knowledge being reproduced, less new knowledge being created, fewer books, and much more. At the undergrad level, there has been a reckoning for quite some time. I know institutions that no longer have political science majors, no longer have philosophy majors. I was looking at my own undergrad, and the philosophy major is hanging on by a thread. I think they're waiting for the head of the department to depart, which should be any time, because he was head of it when I was in college, and that was almost 20 years ago now. And so I think, will they hire another PhD to head a philosophy department in a second-tier state school? Probably not. That department will probably end up being subsumed into something else or going elsewhere, which is kind of what's happened to the political science department there. It's quite depressing. And as, we just one of the jobs of the university, and he kind of talks about this in the thread, is not only knowledge reproduction, but preserving of culture. Having someone who studies stuff, finds out stuff, becomes an expert in those things. Once you break that chain, it's very hard to ever pick it back up again. it's very to get money to invest into it, to get people to study it, to have people with the skills and talents to study it at all, to know about it at all, to have interest in it at all. That's one of the great things about sending people out to talk to kids in school, is to inspire them. And now with everything being, STEM this, STEM that, STEM the other thing, there's no money in any of this stuff, which I totally understand. Go listen to my monologue. Then it is very easy to say, like, well, let's cut back, but the reality is we'll begin to lose this specialized knowledge, and it won't exist beyond old dusty books that no one reads anymore in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. We are culturally poor for the way the humanities are being stripped out of our higher education system. And unfortunately, by the time people realize what we've lost, it will be too late. And it will take a century or more to rebuild it. Will anyone care to at that time is a whole nother matter entirely. But we're losing something very important that we won't realize what we've lost. And that is a repository of our culture, of Western civilization. This is how you lose it. The fewer people do it, the less of it there is. Ah, yes. I had this stored in my notes, but I don't know that we got to it last week. I don't think we did, because I think it came out after I did the Newshour. Anyway, Russia is suspected to be behind a breach of federal court filing system. Federal officials are scrambling to assess the damage and address flaws in a sprawling, heavily used computer system long known to have vulnerabilities. It says here, investigators have uncovered evidence that Russia is at least partly responsible for a recent hack of the computer system that manages federal court documents, including highly sensitive records with information that could reveal sources and people charged with national security crimes, according to several people briefed on the breach. It's not clear what entity is responsible, whether an arm of Russian intelligence might be behind the intrusion, or if other countries were also involved, which some of the people familiar with the matter described as a years-long effort to infiltrate the system. Some of the searches included mid-level criminal cases in the New York City area and other jurisdictions, with some cases involving people with Russian and Eastern European surnames. The disclosure comes as President Trump is expected to meet with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin in Alaska on Friday, which they did, where Mr. Trump was planning to discuss with his push to end the war in Ukraine, which ended up going nowhere. We'll come back to that. Administrators with the court system recently informed Justice Department officials, clerks, and chief judges in federal courts that persistent and sophisticated cyber threat actors have recently compromised sealed records, according to an internal department memo reviewed by the New York Times. The administrators also advised those officials to quickly remove the most sensitive documents from the system. This remains an urgent matter that requires immediate action, officials wrote, referring to guidance the Justice Department had issued in early 2021 after the system was first infiltrated. Documents related to criminal activity with an overseas tie across at least 8 district courts were initially believed to have been targeted. Last month, the chief judges of district courts across the country were quietly warned to move those kinds of cases off the regular document management system. According to officials briefed on the request, they were initially told not to discuss the matter with other judges in their districts. And so, and it goes on to some technical stuff, but this is... This stuff continues. It marches on, and you might be asking, okay, Cameron, why do we care about this? We care about this because we're in the middle of trying to do this peace deal for Ukraine. Trump and Zelensky met today with a bunch of European leaders, and Trump has departed from the ceasefire language and is going for an all-out peace deal, despite the fact that Ukraine wants a ceasefire before negotiating a peace treaty. I've been told from a source that negotiations are underway and a deal will probably happen, by winter, possibly, which, as peace negotiations go, is a rather short timeline. But the fact that this is still happening, that Russia's still doing this, and that very little is being done, it's not even being brought up by the Trump administration, they're not even being called out for this, that this is the discordance of our time. On Friday, we had Trump and Putin palling around in Alaska, but we also know that the FSB, presumably under Putin's direction, or at least knowledge, is hacking the judiciary. So we're palling around with a guy that we're also under attack from. We don't know what they said in the limousine when they were driving away. We don't know why they only had one meeting and not two. I have a story about that coming up. But the reality is Russia's not our friend. And what's funny is that used to be a Republican position, not a Democrat one. That's the part I always find funny. Mitt Romney, back in 2012 when he was running, said Russia is the biggest national security threat to the United States. And when you see stories like this, you wonder if Mitt didn't have a point. Here it is. So the Daily Beast posted this yesterday. It was an MSNBC story. Is this that? No, that's something else. And it was this story here, where it says MSNBC host Antonia Hilton has suggested that President Donald Trump's aides, particularly Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt, may have been frightened by what they'd witnessed during the president's meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. On Saturday night's episode of MSNBC's The Weekend Primetime, Hilton spoke to former U.S. Ambassador to Russia Michael McFaul, an Obama appointee, about Trump's summit with Putin in Anchorage on Friday. Quote, a lot of the press corps was there. They reported in the minutes and hours after the presser that they saw members of the administration, like Carolyn Leavitt, look ashen, almost frightened after what they'd seen behind closed doors. What did that indicate to you? Hilton asked McFaul. McFaul responded, we should all be glad that we did not go to Alaska because I was in Helsinki with you, and I was in Geneva when President Biden met. They traveled a long way for nothing in return, those journalists. He continued, but that suggests to me that this was a bigger disaster than they're letting on. To your point, they're trying to spin it, although they're not even trying to spin it. That's a really interesting thing. Quote, when I worked at the White House, we would have meetings like this. I was the SAO, senior administration official, and would call up journalists and would call the New York Times to say, this is what was discussed, to push it this way. They're not even attempting to do that because they know they don't have anything to work with. The Daily Beast has reached out to the White House for comment. The summit in Alaska was largely considered a failure as the highly anticipated peace deal between Russia and Ukraine failed to materialize. And I don't know why everyone thought that was going to be a peace deal. It never was going to be. After a significant amount of pomp and circumstance that included a literal red carpet and 3 hours of talks, Trump told reporters, we didn't get there, but we have a very good chance of getting there. There's no deal until there's a deal, Trump said. I will call up NATO in a little while. I'll call up the various people I think are appropriate, and I'll, of course, call up President Zelensky and tell them about today's meeting. It's ultimately up to them. And as I wrote in the newsletter on Saturday, Trump spent most of the flight from Anchorage back to D.C. on the phone. And today, Keir Starmer, President Macron, Giorgia Meloni, Ursula von der Leyen, and the Chancellor of Germany were all in Washington, and Zelensky were all in Washington today talking about the potential for a peace deal. The fact that people were in a room with Trump and Putin, saw something that scared them, and came out looking frightening, on the surface doesn't mean anything. Okay, they looked frightened. But I think I agree with McFaul. They saw something. And there's been no comments from the White House today about what was said at the meeting or what was productive. All we have is what Trump said, that they made progress, but they're not there yet. I was watching a video right before the show where Trump was still on mic from meeting with Zelensky and said, we're very close to, a deal. I think Putin wants to do a deal with me, sort of thing. And so that matches what I've heard from my other contacts, that there's, a deal is in progress. I think Ukraine's going to lose a bunch of land. Ukraine's going to be banned from joining NATO, probably banned from joining the EU. They're going to kind of be forced back into the arms of Russia, and they're also going to want new elections and have Zelensky put out as well. Although most people don't know, Zelensky owns a house in Florida, so my guess is Zelensky will be our new American neighbor when this is all said and done. But that was kind of post the Great Alaska meeting on Friday. I found that very interesting. I find it interesting that it's not just left-wing people posting this, because the Daily Beast is definitely not that. There's a lot of people talking about it, which I also find rather interesting. I don't ordinarily play TikToks on the show too much, and this isn't even really a video actually. But I thought it was an interesting idea because when I came across it, I was kind of like, huh, yeah, I think they're onto something. It says the enshittification of American power. First Google and Facebook, then the world. Under Trump 2.0, U.S. statecraft is starting to mimic the worst tendencies of big tech. A term coined by Cory Doctorow in 2022 to describe a cycle that has played out again and again in the online economy, enshittification. Entrepreneurs start off making high-minded promises to get new users to try their platforms. Then tactics change, squeezing users for everything they can get, even as the platform fills with ever more low-quality slop. See Twitter. Ever since Trump retook office in January, in fact, rapid enshittification has become the organizing principle of U.S. statecraft. This time around, Trump world understands that in controlling the infrastructure layer of global finance, technology, and security, it has vast machineries of coercion at its disposal. So, what does an ally to do? Like the individual consumers who are trapped by Google search or Facebook as the core product deteriorates, many are still learning just how hard it is to exit the network. The United States is beginning to monetize its hegemony. And I was like, boom! Oh, that's it! I wish I had thought of it myself. I get mad when someone says something good and I didn't think of it myself. Thank you, Wired Magazine. The United States is beginning to monetize its hegemony. And when you start looking at shit through that lens, and you start thinking about like, oh, that's what Trump is after. He's like, we're in charge of the world, and somehow we're not getting paid from every little thing. We're not microtransacting the world to death. Well, time to put in some microtransactions. And I was kind of like, oh, I get it now. Like, it was an aha moment for me. Like, yeah, it's like, what good is being in charge of the world if you can't get paid? Now, tariffs are the dumbest idea because we pay the tariffs. Other countries do not. But I think that is what it all, like, everyone is so dependent and part of it that it's just a matter of like, yeah. And Trump wants everyone to start running our checks. And it was just such a kind of a huge breakthrough moment, especially coming off just talking about the Russia story and everything, to be kind of like, yeah, that, you know what? That makes a crazy amount of sense. A crazy amount of sense. So I saved it for us to talk about it because it was just too good to pass up. Too good to pass up. And from all places, Wired Magazine. Can you imagine? Speaking of Wired Magazine and AI and all this type of thing, I thought this video on data centers was one for More Perfect Union. If you're not following those guys on YouTube, Twitter, you should be, but was excellently fascinating about what's happening with AI and how it's changing society. Let's hear it.
Investors have been pouring money into AI infrastructure projects. This one has cost about $700 million. Overall, it's tough to give an exact amount on the industry's investment because all of this money is private. But everyone more or less guesses it's at about $200 billion.
So the AI industry has actually been, in some ways, in real financial trouble.
There is no clear path to profitability.
The original idea was that AI was going to be sold to businesses, but that has failed to materialize for all of the reasons that AI just isn't working all that well in the first place.
In February, a hedge fund did some back-envelope math. If you strip out investments in data centers and training, how much money was actually spent on buying actual AI products and services? About $16 billion, maybe less. To actually turn a reasonable profit, they need to raise that number to about $200 billion.
Exact estimates vary, but the general thesis has been backed by major venture capitalists and investment banks. And there's one thing that potentially complicates business cases for these systems: our existing laws.
If there are any road bumps into how they can do that, then selling enterprise AI software suddenly becomes less appealing, both to them and to the clients.
These road bumps are society's foundations. Fair credit reporting violations, when AI denies loans without proper disclosures. Fraud statutes, when AI systems hallucinate financial results and deceive investors. Equal employment violations, when you weed out candidates from women's colleges. Civil rights violations, when a biased data set doesn't suggest medical care to poor or black people. And these protections are exactly what deregulation is trying to undo.
I don't see how that's good for anybody except for the few firms that are making a ton of profit off of it.
But here's the thing about companies that spend hundreds of billions of dollars on products with no clear path to profitability. They try to create their own reality.
So a lot of terms are being thrown around by CEOs that sound incredibly impressive. Artificial general intelligence.
This also
That's
kind
a
of happened with
theoretical type of
automobiles
AI that
as
possesses
well.
human intelligence and can perform any intellectual task a person can.
We said from the very beginning we're going to go after AGI.
I'm sure you've heard it before.
How long before we're literally dealing with a god?
It used to be that like AGI was this very binary moment.
OpenAI has had a definition of AGI in its charter, and I quote from its charter: highly autonomous systems that outperform humans at most economically valuable work. They would consider a system AGI once it had generated $100 billion in profits.
Artificial general intelligence isn't about curing cancer or American dominance. It's about whatever makes them $100 billion.
And that's frightening. Like, I'm gonna pull this story over because things are perilous in AI world. But like, it's not anything other than what can we make $100 billion for sort of thing. And it's kind of like, huh. That's all they need. They need $100 billion. And they'll find any way to get it. Now, I want to bounce over to this story from Fortune magazine because it seems like there is... Oh, this story is paywalled. Hang on. We'll go grab it from Apple News. Because I have a subscription there. And here it is. So, while we're on the hunt for $100 billion, you know, to make AI pencil out and be profitable, it says here, AI experts return from China stunned. The U.S. grid is so weak, the race may already be over. Everywhere we went, people treated energy availability as a given, Rui Ma wrote on X after returning from a recent tour of China's AI hubs. For American AI researchers, that's almost unimaginable. In the U.S., surging AI demand is colliding with a fragile power grid, the kind of extreme bottleneck that Goldman Sachs warns could severely choke the industry's growth. In China, Ma continued, it's considered a solved problem. Ma, a renowned expert in Chinese technology and founder of the media company TechBuzz China, took her team on the road to get a first-hand look at the country's AI advancements. She told Fortune that while she isn't an energy expert, she attended enough meetings and talked to enough insiders to come away with a conclusion that should send chills down the spine of Silicon Valley. In China, building enough power for data centers is no longer up for debate. This is in stark contrast to the U.S., where AI growth is increasingly tied to debates over data center power consumption and grid limitations, she wrote on X. The stakes are difficult to overstate. Data center building is the foundation of AI advancement, and spending on new centers now displaces consumer spending in terms of impact on U.S. GDP. That's concerning since consumer spending is generally two-thirds of the pie. McKinsey projects that between 2025 and 2030, companies worldwide will need to invest $6.7 trillion into new data center capacity to keep up with AI strain. In a recent research note, Stifel Nicholas warned of a looming correction to the S&P 500 since it forecast this data center capital expenditures boom to be a one-off build-out of infrastructure, while consumer spending is clearly on the wane. However, the clear limiting factor to the U.S.'s data center infrastructure development, according to a Deloitte industry survey, is stress on the power grid. Cities' power grids are so weak that some companies are just building their own power plants rather than relying on existing grids. The public is growing increasingly frustrated over increasing energy bills. In Ohio, the electricity bill for a typical household has increased at least $15 a month this summer from the data centers, while energy companies prepare for a sea change of surging demand. Goldman Sachs frames this crisis simply. Quote, AI's insatiable power demand is outpacing the grid's decade-long development cycles, creating a critical bottleneck. Meanwhile, David Fishman, a Chinese electricity expert who has spent years tracking the country's energy development, told Fortune that in China, electricity isn't even a question. On average, China adds more electricity demand than the entire annual consumption of Germany every single year. Whole rural provinces are blanketed in rooftop solar, with one province matching the entirety of India's electricity supply. U.S. policymakers should be hoping China stays a competitor, not an aggressor, Fishman said, because right now, they can't compete effectively on the energy infrastructure front. And that yeah, and they go into the oversupply China has and the structural differences and all this sort of thing. I'm frustrated because that was free on my phone, but it was interesting things are happening with AI. In my LinkedIn newsletter for my halftime report in June, I had kind of written about, in January I said AI has to make sense for a business use case and for enterprise to make money, and in June I thought, it seems like that's happening, but now we're starting to see some cracks, and I think that's interesting. So if you want to get into more on that and how it applies to business and all that sort of thing, make sure to follow my LinkedIn newsletter. LinkedIn.com/in/Cameron Cowan. You can sign right up, and I do very business specific stuff on that newsletter. But I thought that was an interesting aspect of AI. Right now, one of the biggest stories in sort of domestic politics is the what I call the great gerrymandering debate, which has faced off Texas Republicans and Greg Abbott against Gavin Newsom and California Democrats. The current plan, which we'll get into Trump's statement from today in a minute, and it should be noted that the Democrats in Texas who left the state to stop the Republicans from gerrymandering out almost all Democrat congressional seats have returned to Texas today, and the bill is going to go through, and Democrats are going to get gerrymandered out of seats in Texas. Gavin Newsom had threatened that if Texas did that, he was going to gerrymander all Republicans out of California, so that would stop them from being able to gerrymander their way into 5 new seats for 2026. Well, since it appears that that's not working so well, Trump has a new plan, and it involves trying to get rid of mail-in voting with an executive order. And it says here, this is President Trump speaking, I'm going to lead a movement to get rid of mail-in ballots. And also, while we're at it, highly inaccurate, very expensive, and seriously controversial voting machines, which cost 10 times more than accurate and sophisticated watermark paper, which is faster and leaves no doubt at the end of the evening as to who won and who lost the election. We are now the only country in the world that uses mail-in voting. All others gave it up because of the massive voter fraud encountered. We will begin this effort, which will be strongly opposed by the Democrats because they cheat at levels never seen before, by signing an executive order to help bring honesty to the 2026 midterm elections. Remember, the states are merely an agent for the federal government in counting and tabulating the votes. They must do what the federal government, as represented by the President of the United States, tells them for the good of the country. That's not true. That's unconstitutional. To do with their horrible radical left policies like open borders, men playing in women's sports, transgender and woke for everyone, and so much more, Democrats are virtually unelectable without using this completely disproven mail-in scam. Elections can never be honest with mail-in ballots voting, and everybody, in particular Democrats, knows this. And I and the Republican Party will fight like hell to bring honesty and integrity back to our elections. The mail-in ballot hoax using voting machines that are a complete and total disaster must end now. Remember, without fair and honest elections and strong and powerful borders, you don't even have a semblance of a country. Thank you for your attention to this matter. There are a couple states in this country that do mail-in voting exclusively. One of them is Utah. Yes, red Republican couldn't vote for a Democrat if you held them hostage. Utah is mail-in only. So is Washington State. Also, if you get rid of mail-in voting, what are senior citizens who can't leave their homes going to do? What is the U.S. military going to do? What are people who are sick, traveling out of the country, can't make an election going to do? The answer, I would venture to guess, is nothing. It's a great way to disenfranchise people. We already saw this in 2024, coming out of the pandemic. A lot of state legislatures, one, granted them the power to overrule slates of electors for the presidency. Two, it also restricted what secretaries of state and county clerks could do in terms of allowing extraordinary mail-in voting privileges. What it does quite excellently is disenfranchise people. It makes, and the thing is, it doesn't seem like, it's like, well, people will still go vote. Yeah, they will, but the number of voters will be less. And that's how Republicans tend to win elections. When you have lousy turnout, Republicans tend to do better. When you have big turnout, as we saw in 2020, Republicans get their butts handed to them. And so the reality is, by creating these structural changes, gerrymandering the seats, getting rid of mail-in voting. Which, by the way, he can't do that. It's all unconstitutional. The states are in control of elections, by the way. You have this basically structural disenfranchisement of certain people. You basically make it and create a situation where whole classes of people don't get to vote. And when you have a structural situation where whole classes of people don't get to vote, that advantages Republicans. It's that simple. And that's what they're doing. It's another level of disenfranchisement that creates a lot of difficulties for, Democrats, people voting, participating in democracy. That's dishonest. But, as Ron Filipikowski, who's editor-in-chief of MeidasTouch, says, Phase 3 of Trump's attempt to rig the midterms for an autocratic takeover of the Republic. He says he will sign an executive order on how states must conduct elections and they are required to follow it. Which is not true. We're at the top of the hour, so I'm not gonna continue on much more, but I will say, I will finish here that, Dominion Voting Systems has been suing everyone who spread lies about their machines in the 2020 election, and they got Fox News for $767 million, and now Newsmax is going to pay out $67 million. So, if we have any questions about what happened in the 2020 presidential election, if Dominion voting machines were responsible for it, the courts have said, no, they're not, and run them a check. So, yeah, Dominion Voting Systems is now up, what is that? 767 plus 67, almost $900 million from news organizations who told lies about their machines in the election. Funny how that works. We're going to save Trump acting like a dictator and the U.S. is becoming Russia from queer majority until next week. These are kind of more evergreen. Mike Lee has introduced a bill to make all porn a federal crime following 2025 playbook, which, yeah. Last year, right-wing think tank Heritage Foundation launched Project 2025, which laid out much of the policy blueprint for the current Trump administration. And this is from Gizmodo.com, of all places. One of the project's espoused goals was to permanently criminalize all pornography. Now, a Republican senator with kind words for Trump has introduced a bill that would do just that. Senator Mike Lee, Republican Utah, recently introduced the Interstate Obscenity Definition Act, IODA, which would effectively criminalize all pornography nationwide by legally redefining what it means to be obscene. For years, obscenity has been all but a defunct legal category that narrowly defines speech that remains unprotected by the First Amendment. Lee would explode this legal category, expanding it to encompass virtually all visual representations of sex. According to the bill text, a picture, image, graphic image, file, film, videotape, or other visual depiction of any media that appeals to the prurient interest in nudity, sex, or excretion would be considered criminal. In other words, if you have an old VHS tape of some Cinemax-style smut stashed away in your garage, you could, under this law, be considered harboring deeply illicit materials. Some critics have suggested that Lee's definition of obscenity is so ridiculously broad it could effectively criminalize Game of Thrones. That said, the punishments for merely possessing porn under the proposed law seem unclear at this point, as the legislation seems more focused on punishing the creators and distributors of racy material. The law would, quote, pave the way for the prosecution of obscene content disseminated across state lines or from foreign countries and open the door to federal restrictions or bans regarding online porn, the Daily Caller writes. Quote, obscenity isn't protected by the First Amendment, but hazy and unenforceable legal definitions have allowed extreme pornography to saturate American society and reach countless children, said Lee in a press release about the bill. Our bill updates the legal definition of obscenity for the internet age, so this content can be taken down and its peddlers prosecuted. Lee's view of pornography hews closely to that of the Heritage Foundation, which has similarly sought to crush the smut industry. In its Mandate for Leadership, Project 2025 defines pornography as the omnipresent propagation of transgender ideology and sexualization of children, and argues that the people who produce and distribute it should be imprisoned, and that telecommunications and technology firms that facilitate its spread should be shuttered. And we're already in an age of instituting age verification requirements for porn websites. And we've talked about that on this show, we've talked about it on The Living Joke, and all that we're doing. And at this point, I think we should check in on the Project 2025 tracker. And here we are at 47%. There are 317 total objectives being tracked. There are 34 agencies involved. We are still 1,250 days to go until end of term. And Of the 317, 116 are done at 47%. They have been in office 6 months and they're half done. This is real. This is real. And I don't want any hand-wringing about, oh, well, Cameron, it's a terrible thing and porn is awful. I have just looked at the numbers of how much porn is consumed in this country. We're all consuming it. It's like drugs. Seemingly no one does drugs, but we're buying it by the trillions a year. Well, do the math on that. This is real. It's coming. It's happening. All that stuff said about Christian nationalism, trying to change society, remake it in some evangelical view, this is how it starts. If you want to continue to have free speech in this country, save adult content. Because when they ban that, it becomes very easy to ban a whole lot of other things. Like common descent. Yeah. Anyway. Thank you all for watching. I appreciate it. My name is Cameron Cowan. This is the Cameron Journal News Hour. Please follow me on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, at Cameron Journal on TikTok. Please join us on Wednesday at 4 p.m. for The Living Joke. And please also join us next Monday for the News Hour. Today's interview is really, really sweet. It's by a guy named Joseph Bolton, who wrote a series of stories called Old Grandmother's Tree that's a kind of a portmanteau of his French, Canadian, and Algonquin ancestry and those unique storytelling traditions. So that's the interview today. There'll be a new interview on Friday as well, so make sure to check all that. Please follow me on your favorite social media platforms. If you love the audio versions of the interviews, please follow me on all your favorite podcast platforms. Just look up the Cameron Journal Podcast. It's all there. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next Monday. Have a great night. Bye-bye.